The three predators thought they had found an easy kill in the dim light of Manhattan. They didn't see the mountain of a man watching from the shadows, a man who had spent his life turning world champions into memories. In 10 seconds, their arrogance would collide with the baddest man on the planet. And once Mike Tyson stops walking, the entire street goes silent. The Manhattan sidewalk was quieter than usual for an early evening in the mid-2000s. The air carried that crisp New York bite, the kind that makes you pull your collar up and keep your head down. Mike Tyson, the man once known as the most ferocious force in sports history, was walking through the city streets. He wasn't the Iron Mike of the 80s anymore. He was a man in his late 30s, retired from the ring, seeking a life of quiet reflection. Beside him walked Marcus, his security guard, a man who understood the rhythm of the city and maintained a professional, watchful distance. They had just finished dinner at a small, high-end restaurant a few blocks away. It had been an evening of good food and relaxed conversation, the kind of normalcy Mike had grown to appreciate more and more as the years added up, and the roar of the crowds faded into a distant echo. The dinner rush had passed, and the late-night chaos hadn't yet emerged from the subways. The streets were filled only with scattered pedestrians and the occasional yellow cab passing by storefronts that glowed with lonely neon lights. Mike was dressed in a dark, heavy jacket and a hoodie pulled low. He wasn't looking for attention. He was just a New Yorker enjoying the rare stillness of his city. But even in retirement, Mike's senses were tuned to a higher frequency. He didn't just see the street, he felt the energy of it. Then he heard it, a voice. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was brittle. It was the sound of glass about to break, a voice older, nervous, and vibrating with a level of fear that triggered Mike's deepest instincts. "Please, I don't want any trouble, just let me go home." Mike slowed his pace, his head tilted slightly, his internal radar locking onto the frequency of a conflict. Marcus noticed the shift immediately. He saw the way Mike's shoulders squared, the way his stride changed from a stroll to the predatory rhythm of a man moving toward the center of a ring. Marcus's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, his mind already calculating the threat, but his eyes stayed on Mike. About 20 feet ahead, near a closed storefront where the lights were flickering like a dying pulse, the situation became crystal clear. An elderly man, Frank Miller, likely in his 70s with hair as white as a hospital sheet, was backed against the brick. He was a veteran. You could tell by the way he tried to keep his back straight even as his knees shook. He was clutching 2 plastic grocery bags as if they were shields. He was backing away slowly, his movements careful and desperate, like a man trying not to provoke a pack of wolves. Surrounding him were 3 young men in their early 20s. They hadn't completely circled him yet, but they were positioned with tactical cruelty. They wore the uniform of the street, oversized hoodies and sneakers, but more than their clothes, they wore an energy Mike recognized from the darkest corners of his own past, the fake bravery of the pack. The one in the lead was Brandon. He was mid-20s, with a cocky grin that looked like it had never been wiped off by a hard truth. Beside him were Kevin and Malik. They were laughing, a jagged, ugly sound that cut through the night air. "Come on, old man," Brandon sneered, his voice carrying clearly. "You've got a wallet in there, a phone, maybe some jewelry, something worth our time." Frank kept backing up, his shoes scuffing against the concrete. "I'm a veteran, I don't have much money. Please, I just went to the store, just let me pass." Kevin moved to Frank's left, cutting off the escape route toward the street. "We're not asking for much, Grandpa," he mocked. "Just empty the pockets and we'll let you crawl home." Mike was now 15 feet away. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The air around him seemed to thicken, a heavy, invisible weight settling over the sidewalk. Marcus stayed a half step behind, his eyes scanning for other threats, but his focus was on the 3 boys who were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Frank's voice shook as he tried one last plea. "I served my country, please, have some respect." Brandon cut him off with a harsh laugh. Respect is for people who can fight back, old man, and you're nothing." Mike was 10 feet away now. He saw Brandon reach out. He saw the Predator's hand move to shove the veteran. He saw the moment the fear in Frank's eyes turned into total hopelessness. That's when Mike Tyson stopped walking. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just stood there, 20 feet from the confrontation, a mountain of dark fabric and hidden power. The flicker of the neon sign caught the side of his face, the edge of the tattoo, the cold, unblinking eyes. Brandon didn't see him yet. He was too busy enjoying his victory. He shoved Frank again, harder this time. The old man stumbled, his grocery bags rustling like dry leaves. A box of crackers fell out and skidded across the pavement, stopping right at the toe of Mike's boot. Mike looked down at the box, then he looked up at Brandon. "Hey," Mike said. It wasn't a loud hey. It was a low, vibrating rumble, the kind of sound a tiger makes before it leaps. It was a sound that carried the weight of 58 professional fights and the aura of the baddest man on the planet. The three young men froze. The laughter died instantly, chopped off as if by a blade. They turned their heads, squinting into the shadows to see who had dared to interrupt them. At first, they just saw a big man in a hoodie, but then Mike stepped forward into the yellow glow of the street lamp. He pulled the hood back. The realization hit Brandon like a left hook. His jaw didn't just drop, his entire body seemed to shrink. Kevin and Malik took an instinctive step back, their hands rising as if to shield themselves from a ghost. The sidewalk, which had felt like their playground only seconds ago, suddenly felt like a cage, and they were in there with the king of the jungle. The street fell silent. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who had nothing left to prove, and the frantic, shallow gasps of three boys who had just realized they were standing in the shadow of Iron Mike. Brandon thought he was the most dangerous thing on 42nd Street. He thought the old man was his prize, but as a massive shadow fell over him, he realized he hadn't just stepped into a fight, he had stepped into the path of a hurricane. The sidewalk was about to become a classroom, and the baddest man on the planet was about to start the lesson. The air on the Manhattan sidewalk suddenly turned cold, not from the New York wind, but from the presence of the man standing 10 feet away. Mike Tyson didn't look like a man looking for a fight. He looked like a man who was the fight. Beside him, Marcus stood like a statue of granite, his eyes scanning the trio with a professional coldness that suggested he was already calculating exactly how many seconds it would take for Mike to dismantle them. Brandon, the self-appointed leader of the pack, kept his hand raised for a second too long. His brain was struggling to catch up with the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. He looked at Mike, trying to maintain that mask of street-hardened bravado that had worked so well against the elderly, but the mask was cracking. "This doesn't concern you, man," Brandon snapped, though the edge of his voice frayed, jumping an octave. "Walk away while you still can." Mike didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He took 2 more steps forward, closing the distance until he was just a few feet from the group. The way he moved was fluid, the heavy, rhythmic grace of a panther. It was a walk that had been seen by millions on pay-per-view, a walk that usually ended with someone being carried out on a stretcher. "I'm making it my concern," Mike said. His voice was low, vibrating with the kind of authority that commanded the very molecules in the air to go still. He shifted his gaze to Frank Miller, who was still gripping the street sign pole as if it were the only thing keeping him on this earth. The veteran's face, which had been a mask of pure terror, flickered with a sudden, desperate hope. He saw the face. He knew the man. "You okay, sir?" Mike asked, his voice softening just a fraction for the veteran. Frank nodded, his throat working as he tried to find his voice. He couldn't speak yet, but the relief in his eyes was louder than any words. Mike turned his full attention back to the three young men. The cocky grin on Brandon's face was now a memory. Kevin and Malik, standing to the sides, were shifting their weight, their eyes darting between Brandon and the mountain of a man who had just interrupted their sport. They were looking for an exit, but the sidewalk felt like it had shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. "You three need to leave right now," Mike commanded. Kevin, the one who had been mocking Frank's service, tried to regain some of the group's momentum. He puffed out his chest, attempting to look larger than he was. "Who the hell are you? You don't tell us." But Brandon cut him off. He had stopped talking. He was staring at Mike's face. He was looking at the distinct tattoo around the eye, the set of the jaw, and that unmistakable, heavy build. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just talking to some guy in a hoodie. He was standing in the presence of Iron Mike. The aggressive confidence in Brandon's eyes flickered and died, replaced by a cold, numbing uncertainty. "Look, man, we were just," Brandon started, his voice losing its bite. "Just what?" Mike interrupted, his voice now edged with a cold, sharp steel. "Just pushing around an elderly man, just threatening a veteran, just trying to rob someone who can't fight back." Malik, the one in the oversized hoodie, took a small, instinctive step backward. The bravery of the 3-on-1 advantage was evaporating. "We weren't going to hurt him, we were just making him afraid," Mike finished, the words hitting like a jab. "Just using your numbers to feel powerful, taking what isn't yours because you think nobody is watching." Brandon's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and a lingering, desperate aggression. He felt his status among his friends slipping, and in a moment of pure, unadulterated stupidity, he decided to double down. He thought maybe, just maybe, he could talk his way out of the hole he had dug. "Whatever, man," Brandon spat, trying to sound dismissive. "This is between us and him. You should mind your own business." Brandon turned back toward Frank, raising a finger to point threateningly in the old man's face. "This isn't over, old man, we'll find." He never got to finish the threat. In a move that was too fast for the human eye to fully track, a move that had ended 50 professional fights, Mike Tyson closed the remaining distance. It wasn't a punch. It was a surge of pure, controlled power. His hand shot out like a piston, his thick fingers locking onto the fabric of Brandon's hoodie just below the chin. Before Brandon could even draw breath to scream, Mike twisted the fabric in his grip, exerting a force that made Brandon feel like he had been caught in the gears of a massive machine. With a single, fluid motion, Mike drove him backward. The sound of Brandon's back hitting the brick wall of the storefront was a dull, heavy thud that echoed down the quiet street. It wasn't enough to shatter the brick, but it was more than enough to shatter Brandon's reality. Mike held him there, pinned against the wall, one hand gripping the hoodie with the strength of a vice. They were face to face now, mere inches apart. Brandon looked into Mike's eyes and finally, truly understood exactly who and what he was dealing with. He didn't see a celebrity, he saw the abyss. Brandon's eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks of pure terror. The cocky expression was gone, replaced by a mask of shock. He tried to push back, his hands clawing at Mike's arm to break the grip, but he might as well have been trying to move a steel beam. Mike was immovable. "I'm sorry," Brandon's voice came out in a high, panicked gasp. "I'm sorry, we didn't know it was you." Mike didn't say a word. He just stood there, his expression a calm, terrifying storm, letting the physical reality of his strength sink in. He wanted the boy to feel it, the difference between acting tough and the presence of a man who actually was tough. Behind them, Kevin and Malik had gone completely silent. They were no longer the predators. They were just witnesses to a lesson they would never forget. The street had gone silent, but the air was screaming. Brandon looked into the eyes of a man who had conquered the world with his fists, and in that moment, he realized his life was no longer in his own hands. The shadow of Iron Mike had fallen, and there was no place left to hide. The brick wall of the storefront felt like ice against Brandon's back, but it was the heat coming off Mike Tyson that truly terrified him. Mike's grip on the hoodie was like a shackle forged in a furnace, unyielding, heavy, and absolute. Brandon's feet were barely touching the concrete, his body suspended by the sheer, effortless strength of a man who had once moved mountains in the ring. For a long, agonizing moment, Mike said nothing. He let the silence do the work. He let the sound of the city, the distant hum of a taxi, the faint siren 3 blocks over, underline the fact that out here, on this stretch of sidewalk, Brandon was utterly alone with a legend. Behind Mike, Marcus stood like a sentinel of stone. His eyes were fixed on the other two, Kevin and Malik, who were now paralyzed, their own bravado leaking out of them like air from a punctured tire. "You were talking a lot a second ago," Mike said, his voice a low rumble that Brandon felt in his own chest. "What happened? You run out of breath, or did you finally realize who you're talking to?" Brandon tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. He looked over Mike's shoulder at Kevin and Malik. His friends, his pack, were no longer the brave soldiers of the sidewalk. They had backed away, their faces drained of color, their hands raised in a pathetic, pleading gesture of surrender. "We didn't know," Brandon managed to gasp out, the words squeezed by the tension of his own hoodie against his throat. "We were just messing around. Please, Mr. Tyson." Messing around? Mike's eyes flickered with a dark, dangerous light. He leaned in closer, his face inches from Brandon's. "You call shoving an old man messing around? You call threatening a veteran for a few bucks just a joke?" Mike's voice didn't rise, but the intensity of it was like a physical weight. This man stood on lines you couldn't even imagine. He faced things that would make your heart stop just to keep people like you safe. And you think you're tough because there's 3 of you and 1 of him. Brandon shook his head rapidly, tears of pure, unadulterated fear beginning to prick at the corners of his eyes. He felt the physical reality of Mike's power, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. It was the difference between a dog barking through a fence and a lion standing in your doorway. "I'm sorry," Brandon whimpered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched plea. "Please, I'm so sorry, we'll leave. We'll never do it again, I swear." Mike didn't move. He held Brandon there for another 5 seconds, a lifetime in the world of the street. He wanted the boy to feel the vibration of his own heartbeat against the brick. He wanted him to remember this feeling every time he looked at someone weaker than himself. Finally, Mike opened his hand. Brandon slid down the wall, his legs buckling as they hit the ground. He stayed pressed against the brick for a moment, gasping for air, his body trembling so violently he looked like he might collapse. Mike turned his head slightly, his gaze moving to Kevin and Malik. They flinched as if he had swung at them. "You too," Mike rumbled. "You think it's funny to watch your friend play the big man while you hide in the shadows?" "No, sir," Kevin stammered, his face pale and terrified. "No, sir, we're sorry. We shouldn't have been here. We're really sorry." Malik just nodded his head over and over, his hands still raised. The tough energy he had walked with earlier was gone, replaced by a desperate need to be anywhere else on the planet. Mike stepped back, creating a pocket of space, but the air still felt crowded by his presence. He gestured with a tilt of his head toward Frank Miller, who was still standing by the street sign, watching the 3 predators who had just tried to devour him turn into whimpering children. "Apologize to him," Mike commanded. "Not to me. I don't care about your apologies. He's the one you tried to break. He's the one you owe. Brandon scrambled to his feet, his balance still off, his ego lying in pieces on the New York pavement. He turned toward Frank, unable to even look the old man in the eye. "I'm sorry, sir," Brandon said, his voice shaking. "I'm really sorry. We were wrong. We shouldn't have touched you." Kevin and Malik stepped forward, their voices a frantic, overlapping mess of regret. "We're sorry, sir. We're so sorry. It won't happen again. We promise." Frank stood tall, his hand still resting on the cold metal of the signpost. He looked at the three of them, not with anger, but with a quiet, weary dignity. He had seen real monsters in his life, and these boys were just shadows that had tried to act like them. "I hope you mean it," Frank said softly, his voice finally steady. "For your sakes, because the next man you run into might not be as patient as Mr. Tyson." Mike looked at the trio one last time. The cockiness was dead. The pack was broken. "Now leave," Mike said. "And if I ever hear, if I ever even suspect, that you're out here hunting the vulnerable again, you won't get a chance to apologize next time." They didn't wait to hear another word. Brandon, Kevin, and Malik turned and sprinted, not a jog, but a full, desperate run down the sidewalk, disappearing into the neon-lit maze of Manhattan as if the devil himself were at their heels. Mike watched them go until they were nothing but fading footsteps. Then he turned to the man who truly mattered. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a silence more powerful than the shouting. In the heart of a city that never stops moving, two warriors from different worlds stood together. The fight was over, but for Frank Miller, the long journey home was just beginning, and the baddest man on the planet wasn't about to let him walk it alone. The echoes of the three boys' retreating footsteps finally died out, swallowed by the distant, rhythmic throb of Manhattan's traffic. The sidewalk, which had just been the stage for a potential tragedy, felt suddenly vast and hollow. Mike Tyson stood in the center of it, his breathing deep and even, his body transitioning from the coiled tension of a fighter back into the quiet stillness of a man. Beside him, Marcus lowered his hand from his jacket, though he didn't relax entirely. He remained alert, his eyes tracing the rooftops and alleyways, ensuring the pack hadn't doubled back or called for reinforcements. But the street was empty, the air was cold. Mike's gaze dropped to the ground. Scattered at the base of the street sign were the remnants of the struggle. A box of crackers had tumbled out of the torn plastic bag, resting near the gutter. Mike stepped forward and bent down. To see a man of his stature, a man whose hands were built for destruction, reach down with such deliberate care, was a sight that few would ever forget. He picked up the box and straightened his back. He turned to Frank Miller, who was still leaning against the pole, his chest heaving as the shock began to settle into his bones. The veteran's face was a map of exhaustion and lingering fear. "You okay, sir?" Mike asked, his voice now devoid of the steel he had used on the boys. It was a question, but it felt like a protective shield. Frank took the box of crackers, his fingers brushing against Mike's calloused palm. "Yes," Frank whispered, his voice steadier than before but still thin. "Thank you, I don't." Not many people would have stopped. Mike shook his head slowly, his eyes reflecting the dim yellow light of the street lamp. "Should have stopped before I even got here," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but at least nobody got hurt." Frank looked at Mike more carefully now, the recognition that had paralyzed Brandon now blooming into a quiet, profound gratitude in the old man's eyes. This wasn't just a celebrity to him. This was a man who had recognized his humanity when no one else would. "You're Mike Tyson," Frank said, a small spark of life returning to his tone. Mike gave a short, humble nod. "Yeah. I've seen your fights," Frank continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. My son was a big fan. He never missed a match. He paused, drawing in a deep breath of the night air. I'm Frank Miller. I served in Vietnam, came home in '72. Mike extended his hand, and for the first time that night, he felt the true character of the man he had saved. Frank's grip was surprisingly firm despite his age, a grip forged in a jungle half a world away, a grip that refused to be broken. Honored to meet you, Frank, Mike said. The champ looked down the street, toward the darkened residential blocks where the shadows were deep and the street lamps were few. You live nearby. About 3 blocks, Frank gestured with a shaking hand toward the shadows of the apartment buildings. I was just getting home from the store. I didn't think anyone would be out here. Mike didn't hesitate. He didn't check his watch, and he didn't look at Marcus for approval. We'll walk with you, he said. It wasn't an offer, it was a decree. It was the closing of the circle of protection. Frank looked like he might object for a split second, the old habit of self-reliance flickering in his eyes. He didn't want to be a burden to a man who clearly had places to be. But then, he looked at the torn bag in his hand and the dark stretch of sidewalk ahead, and he simply nodded. I'd appreciate that, Frank said softly. They began to move. It was a strange procession through the heart of the city. In the middle walked Frank Miller, the veteran who had survived the horrors of war only to find himself cornered in his own neighborhood. On his left was Marcus, the professional shadow, and on his right was Mike Tyson, the retired king of the ring. They walked at Frank's pace, slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. Nobody spoke much. In Manhattan, silence is a luxury, but here it was a form of respect. The city moved around them, tires hissing on the asphalt, the distant sound of music from a passing car, but inside their small circle there was a heavy, solemn peace. Mike adjusted his stride to match the elderly man. He watched the way Frank navigated the uneven cracks in the pavement, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. Mike wasn't just walking, he was patrolling. His presence alone was enough to make any other would-be predator melt back into the doorways before they were even noticed. For Frank, those 3 blocks felt different than the walk to the store. The fear that had tightened his chest like a cold hand began to loosen. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a man being escorted by the world's most formidable honor guard. Every step was a reclamation of his dignity. As they approached a small, weathered apartment building with a flickering light over the entrance, Frank slowed to a halt. This was his fortress. This was home. He turned to Mike and Marcus, the shopping bags still heavy in his hands. Thank you again, he said, his voice fully composed now. Those young men, they scared me. I'm not as strong as I used to be. Mike looked at the man who had survived 72 and the many hard years since. You served, Frank, Mike said, his voice carrying an absolute, undeniable authority. That means something, that deserves respect, always. Frank's smile widened just a fraction, though it was tinged with the sadness of a man who had seen too much of the world's indifference. Not everyone sees it that way anymore, he admitted. Then they're wrong, Mike replied, the words final and sharp. The bullies were gone, swallowed by the night, but the air in Manhattan still vibrated with the presence of a legend. A single act of intervention had changed the gravity of the street. They say a stone thrown into a lake creates ripples, and Mike Tyson had just dropped a mountain. This wasn't just a win, it was a message. Mike stood on the sidewalk for a moment after Frank Miller disappeared behind the heavy glass doors of his apartment building. The city continued to hum around him, oblivious to the fact that a veteran's dignity had just been saved by the most dangerous man to ever lace up a pair of gloves. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow merging with Mike's on the cracked concrete. He's safe now, Mike, Marcus said quietly. His eyes were still scanning the street, the rooftops, the parked cars, a professional habit that never truly slept. We should move. Someone might have seen you, and once the word gets out, this block will be a zoo. Mike didn't move immediately. He looked at the street sign Frank had been clinging to just minutes before. The metal was cold, indifferent to the struggle it had witnessed. Mike thought about the three boys, Brandon, Kevin, and Malik. He thought about the look in Brandon's eyes when he realized his life was no longer his own. It wasn't just fear, it was the sudden, crushing weight of reality hitting a fantasy. They thought the world was small, Mike rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. They thought the sidewalk was their kingdom because they were young and there were three of them. They forgot that the shadows in this city have eyes. They forgot that respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn. They began to walk back toward the car, but the energy of the neighborhood had shifted. Word travels fast in New York, faster than the 4 train, faster than the wind between the skyscrapers. In the windows above the shops, curtains flickered. A shopkeeper across the street, who had been watching from behind a display of fruit, slowly stepped out onto the pavement, clutching a broom. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask for an autograph or a photo. He just looked at Mike and gave a single, respectful nod. He had seen it all, the bullying, the shove, and the moment the iron intervened. He had been too afraid to step in himself, a common enough story in a city where mind your own business is a survival trait. But he knew what he had seen. He had seen a king defend a man who had already given enough to his country. "People are watching," Marcus whispered, his hand resting near his jacket pocket. "Let them watch," Mike replied. "Maybe they'll remember what it looks like to stand up. Maybe the next time someone sees an old man in trouble, they won't wait for me to show up." As they reached the corner, a group of teenagers, younger than Brandon and his crew, were loitering near a newsstand. They stopped talking as Mike approached. They didn't know the details yet, but they felt the aura. They saw the way Mike carried himself, not with the flashy, false bravado of a street thug, but with the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. One of the boys, wearing an oversized jersey, looked at Mike's hands. He saw the thick wrists, the scarred knuckles that had written history in the ring. He nudged his friend. "Yo, is that the champ?" "Yeah, that's Mike." The boys stood straighter. They didn't catcall. They didn't act out. They simply watched as Mike Tyson walked past, a living reminder that there are still giants in the world, and some of them are looking for balance, not trouble. Mike felt the weight of the eyes on him, but his mind was still back on that sidewalk with Frank. He realized that for every Brandon in the world, there were 10 Franks, people who had given everything to the world, only to be treated as obstacles by those who had given nothing. "Marcus," Mike said, as they reached the black SUV idling at the curb. "Yeah, Mike. Keep an eye on this block. I don't care if we have to drive through here every night for a week. I want people to know that we haven't forgotten where Frank lives." Marcus nodded. He understood. This wasn't about security, it was about presence. It was about making sure the Brandons of the world knew that the shadows might just have teeth, and those teeth belonged to the iron. Mike climbed into the back seat, the leather creaking under his weight. As the door closed, the muffled silence of the luxury vehicle cut off the sounds of New York. But as they pulled away from the curb, Mike looked out the tinted window. He saw the street lamp flickering. He saw the veterans' apartment building fading into the distance. He knew that tomorrow, the story would be all over the neighborhood. It would be told in the barbershops on 125th and the bodegas in Brooklyn. It wouldn't be about a fight, because there was no fight. It would be about the moment the entire street fell silent. It would be about the night the most feared man in the world used his power to make sure an old man could carry his groceries home in peace. But for Mike, it wasn't a story for the papers. It was just a debt paid to a man who had served. A reminder that even in a city of millions, you are never truly alone if the right people are watching. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, but they couldn't outrun the image of the man who had pinned them like insects. In one night, the three kings of the sidewalk had been stripped of their crowns, left to realize that in the jungle of New York, they weren't the lions, they were just the noise. The baddest man on the planet didn't just break their grip, he broke their world. Brandon didn't stop running until they reached the neon-blurred chaos of a busy intersection, miles away from the quiet street where they had encountered the ghost of a legend. He collapsed against a cold metal light pole, his chest heaving, his breath coming in jagged, painful gasps. Behind him, Kevin and Malik caught up, their faces slick with sweat and eyes wide, with the kind of primal terror that doesn't wash off easily. For a long time, nobody spoke. The ambient noise of the city, the shouting of tourists, the honking of yellow cabs, felt like a dull roar compared to the deafening silence that had occupied that sidewalk minutes ago. Brandon looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He gripped the metal pole tighter, trying to steady himself, but the vibration of the city seemed to amplify his own weakness. He could still feel the phantom pressure of Mike Tyson's hand on his chest. It wasn't just the strength of the grip, it was the weight of the man's soul. It was the realization that he had looked into the eyes of a man who had faced the most dangerous humans on the planet and walked away a king. "Yo," Malik finally whispered, his voice cracking. He wiped a hand across his forehead, his Knicks hoodie soaked with sweat. That was him. We almost tried to rob a veteran in front of Mike Tyson. Do you realize how close we came to not walking away at all?" Kevin leaned over, his hands on his knees, staring at the pavement. The cockiness that had defined his walk earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow, sinking feeling in his gut. "We are lucky to be alive, Brandon." You saw his eyes. He wasn't even angry. He was disappointed, like he was looking at garbage. Brandon flinched. The word garbage stung more than the physical confrontation. For months, the three of them had built a reputation on those blocks. They were the ones people crossed the street to avoid. They were the ones who dictated the rules of the sidewalk. They had convinced themselves that they were the apex predators of the concrete jungle because they could intimidate an old man with grocery bags. But in 10 seconds, Mike Tyson had dismantled that entire identity. He hadn't used a weapon. He hadn't even thrown a punch. He had simply existed with more authority than the three of them combined could ever hope to muster. "Shut up," Brandon snapped, though there was no heat in it. It was a hollow command, the last gasp of a dying ego. "No man, Kevin's right," Malik said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense hiss. "We pushed an old man, a veteran. My grandfather was in the service, Brandon. What the hell were we doing? We were looking for a score, but we almost became a statistic." The reality of their actions was beginning to settle in, now that the immediate threat of Mike's fists was gone. The adrenaline was being replaced by a cold, sickening shame. They had spent the night hunting for respect through fear, but they had ended up finding a mirror, and they didn't like what was looking back. Brandon looked at his friends. He saw the same reflection in them. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked like the very people they used to mock. He said he better not hear about us doing this again," Brandon whispered, his voice trembling as he remembered the vibration of Mike's voice against his ribs. "He meant it. You felt it, right? The way he held me, he wasn't even trying. He could have ended it right there." Kevin nodded slowly. "The street's going to know, Brandon. People saw that shopkeeper, the kids at the newsstand. They saw us run. We can't go back there acting like we're the bosses." That was the ultimate price in their world. Reputation was their only currency, and tonight they had gone bankrupt. But as Brandon stared out at the passing crowds, a different thought began to take root. It wasn't just about the fear of Mike Tyson. It was about the way Mike had looked at Frank Miller. Mike had treated the veteran with a level of respect that Brandon hadn't seen in years. He hadn't looked at Frank as a victim. He had looked at him as an equal. Two men who had seen the world's darkness and survived it. "We are done," Brandon said suddenly, his voice gaining a strange, brittle firmness. "Done with what?" Kevin asked. "Done with this." Brandon gestured to the three of them, to the dark corners they liked to haunt. "If we keep going like this, we're going to run into another Mike Tyson. Or worse, we're going to keep being the kind of people that make men like him have to stop walking." Malik looked at him for a long time, then slowly nodded. "I'm going home, man. For real, I think. I need to talk to my family." The trio, once a unified front of intimidation, began to drift apart right there in the middle of the crowded intersection. The pack was officially dead. Brandon watched them disappear into the throng of people, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. He stayed by that light pole for another hour, watching the world go by. He thought about Frank Miller's grocery bags. He thought about the iron grip of a retired legend. And for the first time in his life, Brandon didn't want to be feared. He wanted to be the kind of man who didn't have to run when the light hit his face. Mike Tyson had spent his life in the spotlight, but it was the moments in the shadows that truly defined the man he had become. As the city blurred past his window, he wasn't thinking about the three boys he'd broken. He was thinking about the debt every man owes to those who came before. In the silence of the night, the baddest man on the planet reveals his soul. The interior of the SUV was a world of leather and soft, blue ambient light, a stark contrast to the gritty, orange-tinted reality of the Manhattan sidewalk they had just left behind. Mike Tyson leaned his head back against the headrest, his large frame taking up most of the rear seat. Outside, the city was a smear of neon, the high-end boutiques, the late-night diners, the endless sea of people who would never know what had just transpired. Marcus drove with a steady hand, his eyes flicking occasionally to the rearview mirror. He had worked for Mike for years. He had seen the champ at his highest highs and his lowest ebbs. He had seen him mobbed by thousands, and he had seen him sitting in total isolation. But tonight was different. Tonight hadn't been about fame, money, or the ring. It had been about a code that existed long before gloves were ever laced. "You're quiet, Mike," Marcus remarked, his voice cutting through the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Mike didn't answer immediately. He was looking at his hands, resting heavy on his lap. These were the hands that had conquered the world, hands that had held championship belts high while the world screamed his name. But as he looked at them now, he didn't see a boxer. He saw a man who had nearly watched an injustice happen in silence. "I was thinking about my old man, about Cus D'Amato," Mike finally rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying the weight of a lifetime. "And I was thinking about Frank." Mike wasn't a man given to long speeches, but when he spoke, the words carried the density of lead. "Frank Miller," he said, "he was in Vietnam, came home in '72. Do you have any idea what that was like, Marcus? To go over there, see the things he saw, face the things he faced, and then come back to a country that didn't even want to look him in the eye. He survived the jungle just to come home and be ignored." Marcus nodded slowly. "Hard times. A lot of those guys never really felt like they belonged after that." "Exactly," Mike said, his gaze fixed on a flickering street lamp passing by. "He survived all of that. He survived the traps, the war, the loss of his brothers. He spent his youth protecting a world that eventually forgot he existed. And then, decades later, he's just trying to get home with a box of crackers, and three kids who haven't done a damn thing with their lives think they have the right to put their hands on him, to make him feel small." Mike's fist clenched instinctively. The leather of the seat creaked under the pressure. "It's the lack of respect, Marcus. It's the way people think that because someone is old, they're less than. They see the white hair and the slow walk, and they think they see a victim. They don't see the history. They don't see the scars. They don't see the warrior that's still inside." Leo paused, the silence in the car growing heavy. He wasn't just talking about Frank. He was talking about a world that had become obsessed with the now and the loud, a world that had lost its appetite for the quiet dignity of service. When I was in the ring, Mike continued, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a raw honesty, people respected me because they were afraid of me. That's a cheap kind of respect, Marcus. It's thin. It ends the moment you lose or the moment you get old. But the respect Frank Miller deserves, that's different. That's the kind of respect that should be the foundation of everything. You don't lay a hand on a man who built the world you're standing on. He thought back to the moment he had pinned Brandon against the brick. He remembered the boy's heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. In that moment, Mike hadn't felt like a celebrity or a champion. He had felt like a balanced scale. He had stepped in to correct a tilt in the universe. Those boys, Mike said, his eyes narrowing, they didn't just try to rob him of his money. They tried to rob him of his peace, in his own neighborhood. After everything he's already given, no, not on my watch, not while I still have breath in my lungs. Marcus looked in the mirror again. He saw the fire in Mike's eyes, the same fire that used to strike terror into the hearts of heavyweights. But this fire wasn't destructive. It was protective. It was the fire of a man who had finally found the true meaning of his strength. You did a good thing tonight, Mike, Marcus said firmly. You reminded them that there's always a bigger force in the world, and you reminded Frank that he hasn't been forgotten. Mike exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to vent the last of the evening's tension. I hope so. I hope that kid, Brandon, I hope he lays awake tonight. I hope he feels that brick wall against his back every time he thinks about picking on someone smaller than him, because the next time he tries it, I might not be there to just hold him, and he might not like what happens next. The SUV turned onto the quiet, tree-lined street where Mike's home waited. The chaos of the city felt a million miles away. As the vehicle came to a stop, Mike didn't move for a moment. He just sat there, a titan in the twilight, reflecting on the thin line between a predator and a protector. He realized then that his career in the ring had been a preparation for moments like this. The strength, the speed, the fame, it was all just a toolkit, and tonight he had finally used those tools for their highest purpose. Get some rest, Marcus, Mike said as he opened the door. It's been a long night. You too, champ, Marcus replied. Mike stepped out into the night air. He looked up at the moon, hanging silver and cold over the New York skyline. For the first time in a long time, the iron felt light. He had walked through the fire, and for once, he hadn't been fighting for a title or a purse. He had been fighting for a man named Frank Miller. And in the silence of Manhattan, that was the greatest victory of all. The sun rose over New York the next morning, just as it always does. The city moved on, unaware of the miracle that had occurred in the dark. But for one veteran and 3 broken boys, the world would never look the same. This wasn't just a story of a legend, it was a story of the light that refuses to be extinguished. And it all started when the baddest man on the planet decided to stand for what was right. The next morning, the Manhattan street corner looked entirely ordinary. The trash was being collected by rumbling trucks, the commuters were rushing toward the subway with their heads down, and the smell of fresh coffee from the corner bodega replaced the crisp, cold air of the previous night. There was no yellow tape, no sirens, and no visible scars on the brick wall where Brandon had been pinned by a legend. But the silence was different. In the small grocery store across the street, the shopkeeper who had watched the confrontation from behind his fruit display was telling the story to his first customer of the day. He didn't mention the boxing stats or the fame. He spoke about the way Mike Tyson had stepped into the light. He spoke about the way the champ had treated Frank Miller, the veteran, not as a helpless old man, but as a superior officer who deserved every ounce of protection the world could offer. Word began to ripple through the neighborhood. In the parks, in the gyms, and on the stoops of Harlem and Brooklyn, The story of the Iron and the veteran became a local legend. It wasn't a story of violence, it was a story of presence. It was a reminder to every person who felt invisible that someone, somewhere, was watching. It was a reminder that in a city of millions, no one has to be truly alone. For Frank Miller, the morning brought a peace he hadn't felt in decades. He sat at his kitchen table, the box of crackers Mike had rescued sitting on the counter. He didn't feel like the victim of a near mugging. He felt seen. He felt like his years of service, the sweat in the jungle, the long nights in 72, the sacrifices he thought the world had forgotten, had finally been acknowledged by the only man whose acknowledgement truly mattered. He realized that while his body had slowed, his dignity was still as sharp as a bayonet, polished by the respect of a king. And then there was the trio. Brandon, Kevin, and Malik didn't meet up that day. For the first time in years, the pack was silent. Brandon spent the morning in his small apartment, looking at a photo of his own father in a military uniform, a photo he had ignored for years. He felt the phantom pressure on his chest, but it didn't feel like an attack anymore. It felt like a hand reaching out to pull him back from the edge of a wasted life. He realized that being a predator was the easiest thing in the world, but being a man like Mike Tyson, that took a strength that couldn't be found in a gym or a gang. It was a strength of character. Mike Tyson himself was back in his routine. He didn't check the news to see if the story had broken. He didn't call his publicist to brag. He just went for his morning run, his heavy footfalls echoing the same rhythm as the night before. As he ran past a group of kids playing basketball on a fenced court, he saw them stop and watch him. They didn't shout, "Iron Mike," or ask for a signature. They just watched with a new kind of respect. They had heard the whispers on the street. They knew that the Iron wasn't just a name for his fists, it was a description of his soul. Mike realized that in a city of millions, one act of justice had created a sanctuary. He had taught 3 boys that the world has consequences, and he had taught a veteran that the world still has heroes. He hadn't just saved a man's groceries, he had saved the neighborhood's faith in what was right. The Manhattan sidewalk was quieter than usual the following evening, but this time it wasn't a silence of fear. It was a silence of peace, because everyone knew that in the shadows of the city there are legends who walk among us. And as long as the Iron is watching, the light will always find its way home. You've seen what happens when power meets purpose. You've seen how one man's decision to stop walking changed the lives of everyone on that street. But this story isn't just about Mike Tyson. It's about the warrior that lives inside you. Are you the one who walks past, or are you the one who stands your ground for those who can't? The world is full of predators, but it is also full of protectors. Which one will you be when the street falls silent? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the weight of respect and the power of justice, then do not let it end here. Hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video to honor the veterans who, like Frank Miller, have given everything for us. And most importantly, share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being tough isn't about who you can break, it's about who you are willing to protect. Leave a comment below with the word Iron if you believe that respect should never be retired. Tell us, have you ever seen a legend stand up for the little guy? We read every single story. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay strong, and never ever look the other way.